And I'll share something here which I haven't shared to many people. After the general elections where I lost, before I was kicked out of the party, and I already made my remarks, which eventually presumably was the reason why he and the others weren't comfortable with me being around. And for those who didn't know, I basically asked, in my mind, politely for the president to step down after poor showing in the elections, but that's history, that's done. That led to me being suspended. What many people didn't know was between November 2022 and January 2023, where that suspension happened, I was
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father and son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Today we've got a special guest, an ex-consultant who then went into politics. I wonder if you know where this is going. And then from politics into podcasting, and now in the space of investments in VC, we have none other than Shahril Hamdan here with us. Shahril, thanks for being here on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Shahril, I want to first ask, we'll talk about your career trajectory and the things that you're doing currently. But before that, maybe tell us a little bit about you. Where did your initial kind of cognizance of influence, power, and systems really come from?
Big question to start. So I'm a child of mixed parentage. My mother is ethnic Chinese, my father ethnic Malay. And I begin with that because I think that shaped a lot of who I became / have become, personality-wise. I also grew up in a 2-bedroom flat in Section 8 in Shah Alam. So what would now pass off as low-cost flats. I also bring that up because I think that also shaped my sense of whether it's justice or my sense of self, and both being anchored to that past where I started from, but also wanting to break out of that, which is a journey that one goes through. And the mixture of both those elements, being a child of mixed parentage and also sort of growing up working class in the suburbs, made me interested in politics fairly early, because I encountered race as a concept, I think, quite early in my childhood. Because you grow up in that kind of area, the fact that my mother was ethnic Chinese was very visible. And I encountered, I don't know if racism is the right word, but people would say stuff about my mother, and the fact that I didn't look Malay.
How did that make you feel?
Uncomfortable, obviously. And I went through my own journey of first sort of trying to downplay the Chinese bit to fit in within a community and within a setup that, because my mother was very visibly Chinese. And some people, when they get married, they convert, they sort of become Malay, so to speak, beyond the religion. She didn't, and she hasn't. And she's retained everything about language, about how she looks and how she dresses and all the rest of it, right? Obviously, as a child growing up wanting to fit in a community where there weren't many ethnic Chinese, you can imagine, because it's not that income level, right? It was a bit sort of jarring. Then obviously as you grow up, you realize, hey, that's not the case. You ought to be happy and comfortable who you are. So that, without getting too deep to start off with, but I think that's when my sense of politics, my sense of Malaysia's history, my sense of being very skeptical of the idea of absolute categories of identity and race especially became very prominent. And I would say then my decision afterwards to join a Malay party is also consistent with my journey in life of always slightly taking the road less traveled, and in the first instance appearing to be inconsistent with my own view, and always trying to change something from within, sometimes with success, sometimes not.
Let's talk about your time in politics. You mentioned earlier taking the road less traveled, and maybe being, maybe being slightly a bit of an outlier, wanting to make change from within. Maybe tell us when you were with UMNO, was there any kind of feeling that you were perhaps a little bit different? Not just culturally, but I think also just given your background as well. You were with McKinsey previously. Did that kind of make you feel a little bit different within the party? What were some of the challenges?
Yeah, all the time. And that's maybe the theme of my life so far, which is the desire to fit in and the failure to fit in completely, ever. So I started off with a story about not fitting in Shah Alam, right? And even when I was in UMNO, it was that struggle. And it's almost a dance between two extremes, right? How much does one change oneself, or at least the appearance of oneself, to fit in, knowing full well that fundamentally there is a disjuncture, not just ideologically, in the way that maybe I've sort of previewed in my first answer, but the background, the fact that I did not subscribe to a lot of the sort of house assumptions about house truths about politics or about certain issues, and trying to convince my colleagues who saw the world differently to see it a bit more my way. And so, yeah, I mean, in a word, yes, it was always a struggle to fit in. But I wonder if that would have always been true anywhere I went.
What were some ways that you maybe, eventually managed to get people on board? Obviously, with your background, I would assume you would come in with a slightly more pragmatic lens to look at things. But then the reality is then in these sorts of scenarios, there are other nuances as well that you have to navigate. So what were some of the ways that you were able to kind of rally support, but also collaboration, both within the party, but with other parties as well?
So I think it begins with my own checking of myself to ensure that I was listening. Because it's very easy for us to go into whatever entity, organization, and feel like, okay, I want to go in and change it, right? But the only chance you have of actually doing anything is if you are willing to listen to the view that is, intuitively maybe different from you. And I went through that journey. I continue on that journey where I learned a lot from people that maybe initially I thought, I'm here to change, right? And I realized, for example, that just because I grew up in the sort of working class Malay suburb type of community does not give me any right to say I understand what the sort of Malay psyche is, for example, from a state in the East Coast. And I needed to spend time with people. I needed to understand what it was for people who grew up there, stayed there, did not have the exposure that I did not have the fortune and the luck that I did to go overseas, to work in an MNC, and then I can't expect their worldview to be the same as mine. Obviously, intuitively, I knew that, but it's different from just saying you know it versus spending time with them and saying, hey, yeah, he does have a point in that perspective. Going home on those long drives, or that's when I started reflecting. And I never want to lose that. And I think I didn't lose that, thankfully. And that gave me some opportunities to sort of persuade people in certain micro cases. I wouldn't say I succeeded in my overall sort of desire to sort of make the political party I was with become more progressive. I would argue it's actually become the other way over the time that I was there. But in specific cases with friends that you could have deep conversations with, I would sort of position, the thing that I was constantly trying to do is to say, like, if we are talking about, quote unquote, the Malay struggle and how to ensure that community succeeds, can we do it in a magnanimous manner? Can we do it in a way that's consistent with the religion that we espouse? Can we do it in a way that is about sort of bringing people along and inspiring people? So being inspirational leadership, as opposed to imposing just because we happen to be more numerically. So that kind of conversations in long journeys or in certain bits of my speeches where I had to hint, because you can't be too public about being too progressive, right? Because from day one, I was already stamped with a label called liberal. So liberal is a bad word within Malay political psyche, right? So I was always Mamat ni liberal is the sort of pejorative, right? And so I obviously had to kind of fight against that, but at the same time tell them, look, whatever you want to call me, this is my worldview, and can you at least see maybe the merits of some of these views, right? And in some cases, they sort of could come halfway. So I hope those colleagues of mine where I had those conversations with are still in the party, manage to also continue perhaps that journey, and maybe one day things become better, at least in my view.
Actually, I think we share quite a lot in common because I understand where you're coming from. When I joined the government as a minister, I went through much the same as you did because, everybody identify people as either you Malay, Chinese or Indian. I was none of the above. So it was very difficult for me to navigate.
Did it give you an advantage though? Like
they did pay attention to what I was saying because I was unusual.
Yeah.
And that was all there was to it.
Yes.
But I realized this. When I have one-to-one discussions with them, many of them actually agree with me. But they wouldn't take it on board simply because it will not win votes. And for example, many of them, I can tell you many of them, but you know what they commonly tell me at the time? Idris, you're right. But we know what you are telling us. The problem we have in politics is we know what to do, we just don't know how to win the election after we've done it. This is the problem because many of them, like introducing GST, we had long arguments about why we must introduce GST in my time when I was there. We had to paint a really robust argument for doing it. And I was one of those that argued we should remove, ISA. And eventually convinced Najib that we should do that. And he did do it. And arguing that we must introduce an ETP and a GTP, identifying priorities. It was tough. I mean, there were some very difficult things to do it, but what you're saying is that it is very difficult to change from within. But if you want to change it from within, you have to navigate. And you have to find enough political capital to get people to come around and agree to do it. I kept on telling Prime Minister Dato Sri Najib at the time the need to make sure that our job is to explain why we have to do difficult things. But we don't wait for an applause because you wouldn't get an applause for introducing GST.
Yeah.
But if you can explain to people that they understand it and they can tolerate you by doing it, that's good enough. And so I think he took it and he understood that. And so a lot of the difficult things we did during his time was simply because he took it on board and then decided to do it. Without leadership, it wouldn't work. It's very tough. But therefore, I think in my view, a lot of what you're saying, that not wanting to change UMNO from within, is going to be tough unless you get the right leaders at the top. It's fundamental that leadership has to change within. Then only you'll find a big change happening for UMNO, in my view.
Yeah. But moving, I mean, what
do you think now Malaysia will go into a transition where new leaders will come into the fore? Because UMNO has reached its real pitch in terms of...
well, it depends who you ask, right? Some of them think...
yeah, they're not winning votes. You see in the last couple of elections, it's quite clear.
The trend is quite clear.
They've got to make some changes. Do you think there's an opportunity today for them to really find new crop of leaders?
I think don't underestimate people's ability to reframe a defeat into some form of success. And that's another thing I've noticed about us humans in general, right? You think something is staring you in the face is quite obvious, but the ability of a collective to convince each other that actually things are okay and there are little wins to grab on and let's figure out this another day. Kick the can down the road because let's be grateful for what we have today. I'll give you an example. I mean, even if you think about UMNO and we say that it's on a downtrend, I think the facts speak for itself. But it is then able to be in a position of power despite. And then you can imagine how with good storytelling, which is another skill we should talk about, you can reframe that as a success. And I think internally that's what's been happening. So, one can argue whether that's a legitimate view or not, but it is a story that says, look, that is the skill of that political party that's able to squeeze out maximal benefit or gains despite everything else that we know. But I wanted to just riff off what you just said, because I think it's also moving on from UMNO per se. It's what I've reflected is it is important not just that the leadership of anything is right, as you correctly pointed out, but it's important for us to be self-aware that one can only succeed if you are set up for success.
Yeah.
And I think now turning 40, I've recognized that humility, if you will, of that you can't change the world. Like, not fatalistic. It's not on your feet. Even if you have the best intentions, even if you try your best, even if you think you're equipped with you can't change things alone. And if you go into a shop, whatever that shop is, and the circumstances are not set up for success, 9 times out of 10, you will not succeed in spite of. You will fail because of. And in that context, I'm not saying that we shouldn't welcome adversity but I've gone through a few points in my career in which now when I look back and I feel frustrated in the first instance, and then I realize, no, maybe the learning here is I need to know myself that, okay, given who you are, Shahril, what can you do in knowing who you are and the impact you want to make sure that now in your next few decades, go into situations and circumstances where you don't have to try and be the hero.
Right.
You don't have to swim against the tide all the time.
Yeah.
But there is also credit in identifying places where the tide is somewhat with you and you are set up for success, because what gives you fulfillment is not that you tried. What gives you fulfillment is the impact that you deliver. So I'm sort of changing my frame, right? I think in my youth, it was about, okay, come what may, I'm just going, because I'm the man, and I've got a few other friends who are the man also, then we'll sort things out. I don't see the world that way anymore.
Yeah. So moving from a place where we see the adversity itself or the challenge itself,
almost like a romantic,
this romantic idea of challenge, when actually the real goal should be the impact, as you mentioned. And sometimes, in order to deliver impact, there will be some adversity, but there is also sometimes the need to say, where can I ride into the tide a little bit, ride into the wave, so that we get towards that impact a little bit quicker. You mentioned storytelling earlier, and it's a good segue, because I want to talk now about, I think naturally you have always been a bit of a storyteller at heart. But I think this is playing out most evidently currently in your kind of podcast platform with Keluar Sekejap. I think Napoleon said something to the effect of, he who holds the narrative ultimately holds the most influence and power. How are you currently using your influence as a podcaster to still do nation building, but by way of conversation?
Yeah, I think that's exactly how I would frame it, Leon. Like, I never thought that after getting out of public life that I would actually become more public in some way. Unlike my podcast partner, who was already sort of a household name, I was sort of one of those middling politicians that some people knew, most people didn't. But with the podcast, I've got a platform that is, sort of ironically bigger than I ever did when I was supposedly a senior member of a political party, right? And that's how life is. I am using it to sort of make politics a bit more relatable. I understand that for many Malaysians, politics is sometimes doubles as entertainment. So we sort of embrace that in the way that we speak about it, without dumbing down to the point where you lose the substance that makes people engaged to begin with, right? So using the national language, being able to reach to a wider audience, speaking about things I like to think in a way that is balanced and objective, is one way we've been able to hold an audience and get them engaged with issues. And I hesitate to use the word educate, but at least provoke them to have their own set of conversations around particular issues, right? So that's that part. But I'm beginning to also sort of venture into this other podcast called Subtext, which you may or may not have listened to.
It's great.
Very
good, actually.
Which is very different from Keluar Sekejap. So Keluar Sekejap is not a million miles from this. We have conversations with people and we talk to each other, and we comment on current affairs. Occasionally we comment on something less topical, but most of the time it's what's the news of the week and then chit-chat lah, right? With subtext, it's scripted. So I actually write it down and I narrate it, and it's a challenge to me to put on paper, quote unquote, what my actual views are on particular topics that I care about, and I would argue, like, quite different from the conversational Keluar Sekejap. This is more, okay, Shahril, put on paper what you actually think, and it's going to be out there forever. Can you put your name down to something like this, and what's your view? And I found those 2 episodes that I've done, I feel quite energized when I do it. So it's always a sign when you feel energized that you're probably quite fulfilled in that, and it says something to me that maybe this is a role, and this is a life that I could maybe build on, like just tell stories, conversations, provoke people, and then have their own views, and maybe I feel fulfilled by that, as opposed to or I can deliver impact by that, through that, rather than the more conventional political life, which I may or may not ever go back to.
Time will tell, huh?
Time will tell, but nothing too soon. Nothing too soon.
In one of your subtexts, you talk about Najib, actually. That's Najib.
The last episode.
The last one. Can you tell us, the audience here, how would you rate the man as a prime minister and as the leader of our country? What were his strengths? What were his shortcomings?
Oh, I'm speaking to someone who actually served with him in the cabinet. So my view as a semi-insider, outsider, I say that because I didn't actually work with him directly when he was PM. I was still a very junior UMNO Youth Exco member. Only met him maybe twice during his premiership. After subsequent years, when I became more senior in the party leadership and he was out, obviously we had various conversations. But to your question about how would I rate him, I think you got to split the 2 terms, which I've said before, and I think off camera you said similar. The first term previewed why he could have been one of the greatest, if not the greatest, in terms of the desire to reform.
Yeah.
He actually slaughtered a few sacred cows with ISA. I think he liberalized certain sectors in economy. With you, he did he introduced a concept of delivery being more important than just talk and just 50,000 feet ideas. He introduced the concept of government being accountable and communicating through you as well. I guess the Open Day, right?
Yeah,
the Commando Open Day or the ETP GDP Open Day. That didn't exist before and hasn't existed after. So those were big reforms, right? And it seemed like, while there will be criticism even in the first term about whether he fundamentally wanted to reform the economy to be more just, or it was an extension of sort of almost neoliberal economics, so that might be one criticism. But in terms of overall delivery mindset, desire and willingness to change things and use political capital for good, there was a preview that if he became a 10-15 year prime minister, there was in that trajectory, and he even was going to repeal the Sedition Act, right? That he could have been a big deal, right? He could have been in the same league as Tun Razak or Tun Mahathir in terms of impact, right? And changing the country. But then that thing happened, and I think everything subsequent was about that. About that that 4-letter acronym, right? And his political moves was a reaction to that. What appears now to have been a sort of cover up also came from that, and because he responded the way he did, and I don't think you can count him as a great, right? So that will always be. People always say now that if not for that, then he would have been great. But you can't say if not for that, because that happened. Yeah.
Very, very true. I remember clearly when in 2013, the election came out. All ministers had to resign because they dissolved the government at that time. So when the election had been won with a very small margin, I was the only minister that hasn't resigned because I was the senator. That the Senate has not been dissolved. I was in my office.
Also, you could actually be in your office.
I was the only guy that was there. So that's Sri Najib having been appointed as the prime minister. There was no cabinet at that time. I was the only guy around, so he called me to the office. He and I sat down in the office. you could tell at that moment in time, he was so despondent that he said, we did so many things that was right here, Idris. He said, we've been doing everything we said we're going to do. I said the public did not reward us for doing all the right things. You could tell that was the moment he changed. It was a turning point. The first half of his tenure was, I would give him an A+.
Yeah.
As a leader, he was on time, he was kept his priorities, his true north was clear. He knew exactly what we were trying to do. For example, he said, Idris, we could grow our economy at double digits. I could do that, but I wouldn't do that. You know why? If we had to do that, I would to overborrow. Go and gear this country, overborrow and do all the things we want to do.
Yeah.
But that's growing the economy on steroids. He completely knew that. So he wanted to make sure that we stay within the 55% debt of GDP, and he wanted to reduce the fiscal deficit, which started at 6.7. By the end of his tenure, it went down to 3.2.
Yeah.
So every single year he was doing that.
Yeah.
So he knew what was needed to be done.
And he had a philosophy.
And
he had
philosophy. 1 MDB was the thing, Achilles heel. But prior to that, when he introduced Satu Malaysia, it was clear that he wanted to do exactly what you said. He wanted to make them change in the identity politics.
Sure.
And that's why Satu Malaysia was created precisely for that reason. But the turning point was 2013.
Yeah.
He said, we have been penalized. We are not rewarded for what we had to do. Nobody gave us credit for what we're trying to do. And 2013, the 1 MDB story was already ballooning.
Already.
But I kept on telling him, I think it's not that, Dato Sri. It's more to do with 1 MDB story. But it was just starting at that point.
Yeah.
But I think he took it much more that people out there penalized Barisan under his leadership for doing those reform. And so that was a turning point for him. It is a turning point. I could sense that his first half was A++. The second half, I can't say. It was already like, as you say, reaction to 1 MDB. It was a defense mechanism. He was already making a lot of compromises on what he wanted to do, simply because he kind of won the argument for his colleagues that, you see, you did all those difficult things and we didn't get rewarded for it in the political arena. So I think that was a starting point.
And that, to sort of make the responsibility more diffusive, I guess that was also a failure of the party.
Yeah.
Because instead of the party saying, okay, let's continue doing the right thing if we believe in this,
Right.
the response was, let's go back to our base.
Right.
Let's go back to where we know the supposed safe.
So is that the discussions that was taking place in UMNO? I was not privy to what happened there.
Yeah. So again, not try to minimize my role, but I was a junior exco member in UMNO Youth.
But surely you must have observed what's happening.
I observed. I observed, and just to sort of agree with your overall observation, that was the turning point. I entered the party at that point. I entered the UMNO Youth position in 2013, 2014. So after that, right? So then I didn't see from the inside what happened before. I saw it after, and I could see there was a shift towards, let's take care of our base.
Right.
The refrain was, the average Malay, typical Malay voter does not care about all these sort of ETP, GTP. Dia tak nampak benda. That was a normal refrain, right? And what they want is some sense of security, and then why are we liberalizing the security laws? Because for Malays that is something that, so that was that rhetoric, and you could also see one of the years in party convention where he got a large applause when he said, I'm reversing costs on the Sedition Act. So he was speaking to obviously the party base, at the party bureaucrats. And the response from the floor was big applause. I was obviously one of the few that genuinely was disappointed, because I was excited to see the Sedition Act repealed. Then we can say that under Najib, ISA was gone, Sedition Act was gone, right?
Yeah.
But like we both agree, I think after 2013 and after 1MDB became a thing, everything was a reaction to that. But I wonder what lessons you can say about how we react to results or interim results that are disappointing. Have you gone through in your life, right? You think you're doing the right thing. Interim results does not reward you for that? How do we make sure we continue the course as
I
opposed
think
to
the
shift?
case here is that I made my views quite clear to Dr. Sri Najib at that time in 2013 when he and I was having this discussion.
Yeah.
Just me and him, and there were no other ministers there before he formed the cabinet.
Yeah.
And I made it quite clear to him there are two issues here. One is the things that you're doing on transformation. I think you will get a lot of credit for it.
Yeah.
But the one MDB issue is a separate thing altogether. That's the negative side. So today you have made a lot of pluses on the transformation side, but a lot of negatives on this one MDB issue that's emerging today.
Right.
This one, the negatives is now used as a weapon
Against the
positive.
when actually they're
the
unrelated
narrative.
in some ways.
They are totally unrelated. So to your point, if you were to take a check at what the full tenure midterm, and if there was no one MDB, I was totally convinced that he would have been rewarded politically.
Right.
I was totally convinced he would have been rewarded politically. But the
I
one
can't-
MDB was just before the election.
Right. So I don't remember that. I thought it was after.
No.
Before,
It was
right?
already there. The Edge actually carried the story, but it was already prior to the election.
Sure.
It was already there. So the momentum was already being put there. So he was already having that problem. So when people told him the reason why you lost the election is votes because of this stuff.
Because of the good stuff.
Because of the good stuff. And actually, I don't think so.
Yeah,
I'm
interesting.
totally convinced that it was the story about YMDB. Because the Edge brought up the story, and it was already a big story that was happening before the election.
Right.
And so that was it. Of course, as it went through, that thing keep on ballooning.
Yeah.
The one NDB became a bigger and bigger thing for him to handle. And then I think in the end, like Achilles' heel, that was the thing that brought his downfall.
But moving on from his case per se, right, my original question was,
Yeah.
how do we
Midterm.
respond to interim results that are disappointing?
Yeah.
Do we
Okay.
shift course or do we stay on?
Stay on.
How do we be disciplined?
Exactly.
The discipline is you got to handle this one MDB issue. Because that's actually a very different thing. Handling the one MDB issue would have been the most important thing to do. But there are two ways of handling it. One way is to cover the hole. One way to come out clean and say this is why we did it and this is how actually we will manage it. I think I would have the view that any one statesman that would want to do this, come out clean and say this is what has happened, and we come out and find a solution to go and deal with it, rather than cover it.
Sure.
And
So on a broader scale, then where do you know where to draw the line? Let's say let's not talk about one MDB now, but just in a general sense, as you're trying to work towards something, any form of transformation, at some point, when do you decide that it is time to shift course?
it's this. You got to go and explain to the public, win the argument that the gain is greater than the pain that people are going through. And you have to make an assessment, honest assessment, whether people accept the explanation. Don't wait for the applause. So if they can accept the explanation that the gain is greater than the pain, you must continue the process. And to my mind, that's why I call great leaders. Great leaders are distinctly different from good leaders, simply because the great leaders are the ones that have the courage because of the conviction about what they say they're going to do.
Let's switch gears a little bit. So actually, I want to use back your question, but then throw it back to you. Now looking at the stuff that you're doing with GP Bullhound in investing, I think the same question can be asked. I think for you, what are your kind of principles when it comes to investing? When do you see an opportunity? When do you invest in an opportunity? But also equally, when do you decide to exit?
Right. Okay. So big shift of gears. Changing hats into what I do now, which is I work in a late stage venture company. Late stage meaning companies that are sort of growth companies. So we do growth investing into software and tech companies. And because it's in a private equity space, it's not like the public markets, right? Where you trade in a way that trade in and out and try and make a profit from that. In our case, I would say my role now necessitates that I believe in a thesis. and make sure that the whole organization is in line with that thesis. And currently, it is basically, we believe that artificial intelligence will fundamentally change the human experience.
Yeah.
And it's not a incremental wave that's once in 10, 20 years. This is a once in a century revolution that would change how we live as humans, that would change how we relate to one another, how we conceive of work, of education, and how we arrange society. And given that sort of macro thesis, then you start identifying which are the sort of sub macro and areas, verticals, stages, types of companies, geographies where we think that will be the best place to invest in and see results in a fun life of, say, 10 years, right? So that's how one thinks about it, very almost methodically. Start with a big thesis, then express that thesis through specific verticals or areas, get to know the people that you're going to invest in, and then make that decision collectively. We're gonna back this person or back this company because we know they will be part of this overall wave, generate value there, and we know somebody will buy the company at X number of years. So that's, I guess, how we do it now.
Yeah. So, I mean, being obviously proximate to a lot of tech founders and specifically in the area of AI, what do you think are the big opportunities for Malaysia at large in the area of AI? What can we be doing more of currently? What can we also be a bit more prepared for?
I think what we want to be, what we want is quite generic. Like, is any country wants this. Any country will want something close to a full AI stack. Any country will want to have an ability to have applied artificial intelligence within countries. So meaning people can innovate applications on top of the infrastructure that exists in our country, right? So we are lucky because, I don't know, lucky or not, but data centers is a big deal with us, right? So we have the infra, we have the compute power in country. What is not yet clear is, do we have the ability, I don't want to say the talent, but the ecosystem that want to make the talent come or make the Malaysian talents not leave to create application layer solutions.
Yeah.
Because that's where it's closer to the user interface or the user experience. The average man on the street, the life will be most affected, or he or she will see it most affected through the application of AI, not through data centers.
Yes.
I mean, obviously he or she will understand that it comes from that, but what you want is the app interface, right? Or the application layer. And that bit requires not energy, not water, not resources that we have now with data centers, but it requires the tech brains and the critical mass of talents to be in country to do these things. And that, I think, is still a gap that, we can spend hours talking about. Is it the education system? Is it the incentives and disincentives? How do we make the best brains not enter, comfortable corporate jobs like maybe I did, but chase the dream and be more enterprising. So those are various levers that we need to pull better.
Are you and your firm close to identifying a few players, winners today in that game? The AI area,
right.
Who do you think are going to be the winners? Then are you close to in Malaysia?
So we're still looking. It's the diplomatic way to put it.
It's kind of difficult, huh?
It's tough, but I think you bet yourself to find those gems, right? And that's why, for me, PE, VC, private markets becomes exciting because it's not obvious.
Yeah, not obvious.
If it's obvious,
do you try to find good companies and try to encourage them to invest in that area? And if they do, then you might back them. Because many of them, if you like, we are on the edge of looking at how to use AI. Many of them are looking how to use AI within the business. They haven't quite jumped into it. Do you guys in your venture capital search for those winners, do you encourage them, give ideas to them what they need to do?
Maybe on a personal capacity, in as much that I would have any credibility in this space, sure. Right. But as an investing firm, I don't think the moment you have to convince someone to do it, then maybe you're not investable, right? Maybe you're not there yet. So we would rather go into people who already buy into the story or more importantly, have already acted on it.
Yeah. Difficult to find, huh?
Difficult to find, but maybe that's part of the thrill. Because when you find it, then
Sure.
you know you will be in the money.
Yeah.
For sure. But you are searching outside Malaysia as well? It's
Actually,
part of your remit?
our portfolio has been almost exclusively Europe, US, ANZ. Nothing yet in this part of the world, but we have a global mandate, so I'm happy to. I want to
global
change
mandate.
that. Yeah.
So you travel quite a fair bit.
Yes, to try and find that gem.
Yeah.
Find that.
When
gem.
was your last trip on travel?
Yesterday?
Yesterday.
I just got back from Singapore.
Where were you?
I was in Singapore.
What's the
this past
take up
couple of days.
in there?
So Singapore is a bit more, grudgingly have to admit, a bit more encouraging about these things. They've spent billions, I think tens of Singapore dollar billions, just incubating and helping deep tech startups, right? And that's why the best deep tech companies come out of NUS, come out of these other sort of educational institutes, and they have a whole ecosystem where there's this group called A-Star. You should check it out.
Yes, I know.
Where
I know A-Star.
I think they've employed thousands of PhD researchers, only a fraction of which will become entrepreneurs. But imagine that commitment by government to spend money and give salary to 3,000 plus just to come up with research, just to come up with things that could be commercialized. Then you have a smaller team that commercializes it, right? And then there's an arrangement so that the original IP guy gets some equity, So that long-term thinking, because this tens of billions did not start yesterday. Many years ago. And now it's spitting out some early stage deep tech companies that are still a bit too early for someone like us, but maybe in a couple of years they become more interesting.
I know about A-Star. And Philip Yeo is one of the architects. He's with me on Sunway board.
Right, yes.
So I have lots of discussions with him about what they're doing there. And you're right. They have been far down the road compared to quite many other companies. They've been throwing money at all this.
And they're willing to wait it out, right? They know this is a 5-year, 10-year game or whatever, or longer, right? I don't know if sometimes we don't have that. Our political system or incentives or disincentive doesn't really lend itself to that kind of decision making.
What do you think about this idea from Professor Ricardo Hausman? And he keeps saying that single biggest lever to pull for countries' advancement is migration. And he says if you bring people from one country to another country, that is the single biggest way to leapfrog. And that's what happened to Australia. That's what happened to America.
Right.
All of these countries developed to where they are because of migration. Of course, the exception being, Japan and Germany, they're very insular. But that's in his views. If you encourage a lot more clever people to come and work here in Malaysia, you will deal with those issues. And that's exactly what Singapore is doing. Singapore has opened the door. He said, you are welcome to come here, provided we know that you're the right kind of talent that's required here. But of course, in Malaysia, we are quite protective of our own agenda, etc. But if we open the door, do you think there's an opportunity today, because we have now reached a point when AI is going to govern how the world is going to shape? Should we think as Malaysia invite in as many as talented people and welcome them to Malaysia in this area, not any other area, that's just here?
Yeah, I think in a word, yes, because you're absolutely right. It's always been true, but maybe more true now, that social capital and intellectual capital is going to be the two things that will make a country or an economy grow to what its potential is. And if you limit social and intellectual capital, then you're going to be middling at best. And again, grudgingly using Singapore as an example, that country is built on those two things, right? They don't have any. I mean, the national myth that has some truth to it is that there's no natural resources. It's a country that's surrounded by potentially hostile, threats and all that kind of stuff, which I don't think is true. But that's their sort of founding and foundational stories that they tell themselves, right? Going back to storytelling, even nation making is about storytelling. So Singapore has that to a T, and the way they run and organize their country is based on social and intellectual capital. How do we get the right people in? How do we retain our best talents? And so in Malaysia, the easy answer is to say that first we need to retain our best brains, right? Because our best brains are being exported to Australia, Singapore, and wherever else in Europe and in the US as well. So retention, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't welcome the best brains from all around the world. So yes, but you and I both know how difficult it is politically for that to be sold, right? Because you just scroll online, and just like any other country, we have certain xenophobic tendencies. Let's call it for what it is, right? And anyone much, and especially people like you and me who are going to be seen as part of the elite, speak English on a podcast in Malaysia, they'll be like, yeah, you, of course you want all these migrants in, of course you want all these expats in, but you don't have to deal with them in, for them it's foreign. So foreign migrant workers are something that not everybody likes to see, and for whatever reason, which we can talk about. So I guess in Malaysia, this particular question about whether you welcome talent or not is one of those many things where, because we are trying to optimize for various things, we're optimizing for social cohesion, we're optimizing for the Bumiputraism, we're optimizing for sort of making sure that all geographies, all regions feel happy and feel contented. We never actually do the most optimal decision making or solution for a particular problem we want to solve.
Everything's compromise.
Everything is a compromise. So we are. I've said this a few times. We are a nation of compromises. And because we are a nation of compromises, maybe that's why we've been peaceful. Maybe that's why we've beaten the odds in terms of not having too many conflicts. So yes, I don't want to be ungrateful about that.
Peaceful by way of inaction.
But because of those compromises, we never go for it. Whatever it is, we never go for it. Whether it is liberalizing certain things, whether it's opening up the press, whether it's something like welcoming migrants, whether it's about making universities more accessible, being more meritocratic, all that kind of stuff. You can't do everything full on in Malaysia because you're managing and you're optimizing for different outcomes that are not always consistent.
What would be a good way then to navigate some of these narratives lah? Maybe a perspective from how do we do this from within the system? What are ways we can also do this through platforms like yours and potentially even this one to kind of curb some of that protectionist thinking lah? And obviously, this is not something that can be done overnight.
It can be done in overnight or even our lifetime. In that last subtext episode, if you guys listen to the end, my sort of pop sort of philosophy or thinking that captured, I think, my train of thought was that we just have too many disparate stories, and disparate narratives in this country, and it started from maybe even our founding. Certain countries that are able to make citizens feel really invested in a narration, in a foundational myth, and in a sort of true north. They start from the beginning of the birth of the nation, right? So the myth of America is this is the land of the free, this is where you could come from anywhere and you could make it. The fact that it's actually untrue for many people is almost beside the point, right? The story of the country is that. Singapore, we sort of commented a bit. Malaysia it's not clear to me that our founding generation, and great as they were, and the subsequent generations, perhaps more importantly, were able or desired to tell that story across different communities, religions, races. It was tolerance. It was, let's get along, let's not fight with each other. But what is a set of Malaysian values that we all aspire to? I don't think even today in 2025, you ask people, they can actually articulate what Malaysian values are. Is it compassion? I don't know how can you say that. I don't think that's part of our myth or our self-image. Is it a sense of all of us believe in meritocracy and we want to do the best thing, the most innovative? Are we an innovative country? I don't think that's part of our self-image. Are we I don't know, are we all religious people? I think that's also hard to do a self-image, because when you have various religions, then you have different conceptions of God and religion and all that kind of stuff. So that was never really going to be, even though Rukun Negara says kepercayaan pada Tuhan, but in itself is telling you the diversity is our story, right? Or our diversity is great as a starting point, but then what's the unifying, the unity in diversity tagline that we used to hear 10 years ago? Diversity is there. Unity, what unifies across? And every prime minister administration tries to fill in. It's never actually, I think, cut through to enough of the population that it becomes a point of pride and a point of belief that is so core to who you are as a Malaysian. Until you achieve that elusive goal, then everything, it becomes difficult, in my opinion. Then making the right, quote unquote, right decision, pushing through right decision in spite of other costs you have to make, other compromises you have to make, slaughtering more sacred cows if it is the right thing to do in 2025 when maybe it was not in 1970. I think you know what I'm talking about. Certain bits around that, right? Then you won't have that will, ability, or capital to do so because you never had that unifying story, right? I think there are the things around our sort of setup that need modernization, and what was right in 1970, 80, 90, surely all of it cannot be right today.
Cannot be.
Yeah.
The semangat can retain, right? In terms of
That's
you know
good,
the Constitution, Article 153, all the rest of it, sure, can defend that, but the expression of that was supposed to be malleable or supposed to move on with the times lah, right? It's not meant to be so rigid that the exact number, exact expression from 50, 60 years ago must be the same today. That surely can't be the case, right? But again, I go back to my principal point, because we don't have a unifying narrative.
What do you think, if you could maybe take a stab at this, what should our unifying narrative or even brand be? Last episode I was fascinated by, you talked about the brand of Najib, and despite all of the things that had happened, that he still retained so much support because he had a very strong kind of brand around him, if you like. So for Malaysia, what do you propose our kind of brand is?
I think it would be a proposition based on what I want, as opposed to based on anything I think is pre-existing. And perhaps that itself is already an indictment of the situation we're in. So I would say I'd like it to be something around compassion. I like it to be compassionate to differences, compassionate to people who are not from here. I want us to be a place where people come and realize, okay, this is not a cutthroat society. You almost feel like you want to be a bit different from your neighbors, right? So going back to our southern neighbor, that's they are meritocratic. They're absolutely clear about being brutal, right? Whereas maybe we can define ourselves as slightly sort of people who, care about one another, are polite. When I grew up, I was always told that Malays are supposed to be polite and sort of soft-spoken and subtle, and I see bits of that. I see bits that are not that. And I wonder if that romantic idea of a Malayness, and I'm sure there are expressions of that in different ethnicities, that maybe we can weave something around that, around a subtle culture, around something that's compassionate, open to other. If you read our history, a particular reading of history would say that Malaysia and this whole place was always open to different cultures and influences, right? From the Hindus to the Muslims afterwards to Christian missionaries, and all of those things are part of our story in pre-1500s and stuff, and even beyond. So there is a reservoir, something there that somebody with a good sort of storytelling capability or political capital can weave into a broader Malaysian myth that can then influence people to be. So I think compassion is probably empathy, compassion, because we have this diversity that's so core, will not change, and we don't want it to change. Can we weave it something around that? I would say that's not a perfect clinical answer, but something around that would be very something I would like, as opposed to imposition. You must be speaking only this language.
Sure.
You must be nationalist in a certain way, or you must concede to the majoritarian community. You can see why I don't always fit in UMNO, right? so I never bought into that, right? I wanted it to be an
Mr.
expression.
Liberal.
I wanted to be an expression of diversity, which maybe I came from too.
Yeah.
Let me make a suggestion. Keluar Sekejap, in my view, is without doubt is the number one podcast in Malaysia, and
thank
it's
you.
still growing and very popular. I'm a big fan, by the way. I follow almost all the episodes. Let me just make a suggestion here for everybody to listen to. Suppose you guys were to do this. You come out and say, we're going to, topic by topic, make suggestions about what Malaysia needs to do on all issues. Let's say education. Have a discussion about education on one episode, and you end by saying, you guys out there listening to this episode, come to this website that we put out there and give us your vote of what policy change we need to do on education. And if you agree with this vote, put your name there, put your IC number, that is your vote.
Right.
And you go down the next episode, come down and cover healthcare, come down and cover NEP, and come down and cover all the subjects. I mean, you have nearly 200 episodes today. And you start by doing it that way. If you reach, let's say, 15 million people that you have now said they put their names there, and they put IC number, and they said, this is what I want to do on education, very concretely, then you become a movement. You create then a movement, and then you can go to the government and say to the government, I have 15 million people who are identified by name, who are identified by IC number, and if you make your change, these people are going to vote for you at the next election. The converse could happen. The opposition says, we actually want to embrace everything that you guys put. And we are going to come out and say, this is our campaign. You will have 15 million people that are out there ready to vote for them. So I think you could turn Keluar Sekejap into a vehicle that will fundamentally change the politics in this country. Because having been in government for 6 years, I know one thing for sure. If there's one lesson I learned, politics is about numbers. It's not about logic, explaining to them about what the right education says. They know that. It's about numbers. So the only number that I recognize is that I have 15 million people, and these are the names, and this is the IC number, and this is what they are voting. Effectively, what you've now created today is a national referendum using Keluar Sekejap. And you have a national referendum, and then you have a movement. You don't have a political party, but you have a movement of people that are prepared to do it. This way, you influence public policy instantly, and you influence the incumbent government, because if they don't, people vote for the other party that's going to stand for this. You will see a sea change, in my view. That would be my contribution to what I
think
suggest.
we should think about it. No, that's a challenge. That's a challenge that we might want to think about. That's a good idea.
And should you re-enter politics? Or what a campaign!
What a campaign!
And we already know what people want.
You already want it. And the point is this: I think people only, as I said, one thing, politicians don't listen to the arguments anymore. It's about numbers. If you have the numbers, then I think you're credible. If I have the numbers, then they listen to you. If you don't have the numbers, nobody listens to the arguments, the pros and cons. Frankly speaking, I believe today, if you did that on GST, there are enough people out there that say we agree with GST. But if you just try to argue with the government why the current government needs to introduce it, they will be so scared because it's fragile government. But if you did that, I would believe today, with proper explanation, people will put their names and put the IC number and said, I support, we're going to do a GST. Because I think we can convince people that if you do GST, it's going to improve the conditions for the poor. Because you can use the money that we put out there to help the poor, actually. So I think it's worthwhile considering there's no other better podcast.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that compliment.
Absolutely. I mean, we can't do it because we are not like Keluar Sekejap. Keluar Sekejap
I think it's a different kind of...
Correct. And you are using Bahasa Malaysia.
I think it's a lot.
It's a lot. So it's a tremendous opportunity to do.
Thank you.
Do it. Go for it, man.
Think about it, sir. I think about it. But I mean, just a last bit about helping the poor. Also, just to go back to your point, Leon, maybe that's also the other thing we could, because I think there's something about Malaysian DNA or Malaysian culture, if using that term so advisedly, that we do sit uncomfortably with, or we have discomfort when we see injustice, and we do care about the poor. And I think there is almost an anti-rich, anti-elite thing that also has problematics there.
Right.
But maybe use that former bit to good and use that as maybe a rallying cry around what Malaysianness is, right? Standing up for the for those who need help and things like that. So maybe that could also be into this imagined idea of a Malaysian myth. And obviously, I'm most attuned to the Malay culture, and even someone like me feels that the way Malaysia is and Malaysian politics is, somehow the Malaysian culture has to express a bit more of the majority sort of vibe. But the majority community, in as much as Malays are it doesn't have to be this abrasive expression that sometimes you see. It can be this subtle, sort of tolerant stuff that we always are proud of. Even in the Facebook comments that are abrasive, they would say, "Oh, Malays have always been tolerant."
Right.
Almost as a point to say, and therefore we cannot be now.
Right.
When actually my interpretation is good. Then our history as a community has always been to be open-minded, to be open to different influences, different cultures. The sheer diversity in the Malay experience across different regions itself tells you that Malays are not this hard, sort of non-compromising. It is about being open to different cultures. It is about celebrating other people. It is about welcoming. And if that's our myth from a few hundred years ago, why can't it be that is the expression of Malay political identity?
Yeah.
So that, in a nutshell, was what I was trying to do when I was in politics, and I don't know if I've been successful. But yeah, I retained that desire of a more romantic vision of what Melayu is.
I think what's interesting about you is the common thread seems to be, and it's interesting that you call your podcast subtext, but that seems to be the underlying thing. With everything, there's always subtext. There's always nuance. The way that one can see you as a systems thinker, but a systems thinker who's also talking about things like social justice, about the different stories that we can tell to shape a nation by way of storytelling. Some people might say that these are kind of fluff or soft things, but actually there's a real beauty when you're able to combine the two things. Now, I wonder for you, I believe you're a bit of a creative at heart. I've seen some of the outworkings of that in your earlier teenage years.
All right. Teenage years. Should we tell our listeners how I used to?
Yeah, but you
used to make noise in.
Yeah, make noise in our old house in Taman Tun. But I wonder, does your appreciation for the arts, for culture, kind of shape your politics and your just general philosophy in life? And maybe you're a big fan of Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
How has Dylan played a role in shaping the way that you see life?
Yeah, by the end of the interview, I'll just come across like some, hopeless romantic or some shape, right?
Hey, we need more of those, man.
So I think, Dylan aside, we'll come back to him in a bit. But as I reflect on that question of my cultural influences, let's start with music first, right?
Yeah.
Actually, when I think back, right, I was always drawn to slightly sort of oddballs. So Bob Dylan, obviously, Nick Drake.
Yes, Nick Drake.
Those are my two sort of people I listen to even to today.
We listen to Nick Drake, big fan.
Great guy, right? Great music. And even sort of the more rock stuff will be. I really liked Pearl Jam when I was younger, and these are different types of music in a way, but they all are about people who were slightly either reclusive, or even in the case of a frontman like Eddie Vedder, was demonstrably uncomfortable with fame and authority. And I wonder if I was drawn to that partly beyond the greatness of the music because of that, right? I wasn't into the alpha male hip hop stars or even the rock bands that were so demonstrably comfortable being frontman, right? I was always a bit the tortured type who didn't really like the fame type thing, right? So I think there's a bit of that has influenced my philosophy, psychology, even my sense of masculinity. So you talk about, for example, my podcast partner. I don't want to speak for him too much, but he would come across, I would think, I've never said this about him or with him, but he would come across like your central casting alpha male.
Yeah, definitely.
He
No
is.
doubt.
I go in, I own the room, and that's him, right? I don't think I've never owned a room. I'm not the boss of everyone, but neither am I going to be bossed by anyone. And I think that's almost that independent spirit that is that is probably a central theme or consistent theme across some of these names and cultural influences that I mentioned. I think when I reflect, there's probably something there about the linkage between who those people, at least on the outside, look like and who I have become, and that sort of spirit that I live by. On someone like Dylan himself, I think why I like him, why I like Nick Drake and these guys is there is something there for every moment, whether it's heartbreak, whether it's joy, whether it's uncertainty, whether it's been kicked out of your political party. There was always a music or a song that I would think about, and I would sort of reminisce or be in the moment with that background music. And of all the sort of influences, it's been Dylan across my entire life, right? Whether it's from the start of adolescence all the way to marriage and fatherhood. He's always been the music of my sort of life and experiences, and that will always be, I think, around. There are two things that I've gone and traveled for 24 hours just to see. One is Newcastle beating Liverpool recently in the League Cup, where I went, flew in to Heathrow, watched the match and chow straight away. And also Bob Dylan, where I've flown to Japan a few years ago just to watch him and then go home.
Yeah. Any central themes from Dylan and perhaps his politics? I mean, he was very.
The other thing about Dylan, right, is he has, because of the sheer longevity of his career, he has been many things, no? And I also maybe resonate with that. He started off as this sort of protest singer for a few years, and after that he almost just ditched that completely. He went electric and did a bunch of other arguably greater stuff. Then he had this Christian phase for a while, like Soul Train coming, yes, correct, where he did that. After that, now it's a whole after the 2000s, I think. Time Out of Mind and those albums afterwards, where it's almost like a elderly it is an elderly Dylan talking about themes of death and themes of, in a way that only Dylan can without being so morbid, right? I mean, there's this song called Not Dark Yet.
Love that song.
It's not dark yet, but it's getting there. I mean, for a guy who sounds really old and is very old, and you know what he's talking about, but he makes it so sort of, you don't feel fearful. It's more of him and his reckoning with his own mortality. Obviously, I don't overstretch the whole thing because this shouldn't be my frame of reference about life and mortality. And as I get older, I get a bit more religious, and I know for me, it is Islam and it's about that. But I think I will always have the appreciation of how beautiful he narrates. And going back to the theme of this entire conversation, storytelling, he is also, not just is he multi-career, not just is he able to speak about themes that other people may find difficult, but he's also a reminder that you can do two things at once. He has great one-liners, right, in his lyrics.
Absolutely.
But he also, what makes his music and his lyrics magical is because if you look at the entire song or the entire passage, it's themselves, the whole passage is the beauty.
Yeah.
So some people... Some musicians are great one-line lyrics. I think Chili Peppers have some good, but then there's no theme across the whole passage. Right? Or hip-hop musicians can come up with one line, and it's like quite cool. It's just one line. Whereas Dylan can do the great one-liners, but the whole song itself is a celebration of literary genius.
Correct. Yeah. Literary genius to the point where he can have the audacity to invent his own words. The life I never knowed.
Yes. And nobody
Which always makes me laugh.
Nobody would.
Only Dylan could do that.
Correct. And nobody would. Nobody would. Yeah.
But I like the fact that you touched on the multifaceted aspect of Bob Dylan, and I think we see a lot of that in you as well. I want to ask, how do you navigate wearing so many different hats? How do you manage that on a personal level, but also on a practical level? How do you make time for the many things that you handle?
With some difficulty sometimes, but with more ease these days. So I feel like when I was younger, it was trying to decide who I wanted to be. Am I a politician? Do I want to work at McKinsey and become rich? Do I want to open up my own company? Whatever. All these things were viable options, at least in my mind. Whether or not I would have been good at any of those, I don't know. But in my mind, they were viable options, and I was always struggling to decide which one. Now, at this age, it feels like two things have become clear to me. Like I said, become slightly more religious and spiritual. And I'll share something here, which I haven't shared to many people. When after the general elections where I lost, before I was kicked out of the party, and I already made my remarks, which eventually, presumably, was the reason why he and the others weren't comfortable with me being around. And for those who didn't know, I basically asked, in my mind, politely for the president to step down after poor showing in the elections. But that's history. That's done. That led to me being asked to and being suspended. What many people didn't know was between November 2022 and January 2023, where that suspension happened, I was in knots about what I wanted to do with life. I wasn't sure, did I want to continue with the political career, which was still an option for me because I was UMNO Youth number 2. The assumption was that I was going to run and hopefully win UMNO Youth head because the prevailing guy was going to move up. And that was the assumption. But internally, I was in knots about whether I wanted to do that. I was like, maybe this is a sign that I need to move on and do something else or take a break. And I didn't have the guts or the clarity of mind at that time in those 2 months to make that decision. I was like, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, you were just paralyzed, right, by indecision. Because I'm surrounded by my supporters who say, no, you've got to go on. It's not just about you, it's about us. And you're supposed to be part of this struggle. These are the guys who, in part, bought into this progressive message that I've been telling, right? And there was a sense of responsibility to them. And also responding to myself, like, am I a quitter? Am I going to leave something?
Right.
So I actually I prayed to God, and I said, can you show me or hint to me what is the right decision here? And ultimately, how I interpret my suspension is his decision was made.
Intervention.
It was the intervention and telling me that now you don't need to decide, I'm deciding for you. And maybe that's why I'm so much at peace with what happened after. A lot of people assume I would have been angry. And of course, I'm still a bit annoyed.
Yeah, sure.
You can be both sort of realizing that was the decision from God, but still be annoyed with the person who did it. Right? You're able to do both.
Yeah.
But in the main, I am so much at peace because I asked for that sign. And there are moments, and both of you are religious, I think, as well. There are moments when God shows you signs, and that He is there, that He exists. And if you are a man of faith, then you would see that as that sign. And I saw that absolutely as a sign.
And because you prayed for it.
And because I prayed for it, I asked it, right? Asked for it. So he said, no, tak payah pening-pening, I show you. So then, therefore, there was a certain irony in the moment where I was supposed to be sad. I was smiling to myself. I was like, okay, that's definitely a God. So, I know it's a long-winded answer to sort of balancing different things. Now I feel more empowered to just be who I am. And trust that if I'm sincere and if I ask for help from my creator, there will be sort of, signs or whatever for me to be able to be who I am supposed to be in that moment. So today I'm a podcaster, I do investing. Maybe tomorrow I go back into politics. I don't stress about it so much anymore because I feel like just be who you are in the present, but take from all these different experiences that I've had rather than see it as separate, different things. They are actually things that can coexist. Why am I a fairly decent podcaster on current affairs? It's because of my experience in politics.
Yeah, sure.
Why am I able to have been, to the extent I was, a politician that had some good traits in him? Maybe because I was a logical thinker that I trained when I was in consulting. These things sort of translate, and if you are able and desiring of them to translate across the different parts of life and different parts of your career and different stages of life, then I think you become a fuller and fuller individual. And that's my aim. If I ever go back to public life in the whole office in any capacity, I would really like me to be a better person, a fuller person, which gain from whatever I'm doing this 10 years or whatever, how many years I'm out, right? And if I never go back, it's okay as well, right? So that serendipity and also surrender really to whatever fate has in store for me, but the desire to then take all this experience and make myself a better person is probably a fulfilling goal in my next decades.
Well, what a profound way to end this episode. Shahril, thanks so much for being on
Thank
the
you
show
so
with
much,
us.
Shahril.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
You know, before we let you go, I actually I texted Ryan yesterday.
Okay. So tell
I
everyone
said,
who Ryan is your
I'm gonna
cousin.
have Shahril on the show.
What nonsense did he say?
Do you, it's like
It's a smart comment.
I remember we were writing you guys had written
Rubbish
some
songs.
songs in Tamantun.
Yes, we
Would
did.
you happen to have those on file? I said, even if you just remember the name of
I
the song,
do.
that's good enough.
Oh
He's
my
like, I
God.
can do better. I actually have
Oh
the file.
my goodness. No, Leon.
So you
it's
talked
gonna be
about
so
being
embarrassing.
an outlier, right? Your song is called Pendatang.
Oh my God. Okay, don't show it. Don't share it.
Too late.
Don't share it.
Let's just hear one refrain, just a refrain.
Yeah. It was so bad. Come on, Leon, don't embarrass me here. This was. This
Sounds
is
like
such a.
Dylan.
You can
I don't know if it's Dylan.
you can add a songwriter as a feather in your cap as well.
Yeah. That was when I was 18, 19.
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
around
yeah,
there.
around
lah.
that, yeah.
Your
You
Taylor's
can see
days.
the Dylan influence.
Already at
Yeah. Clearly there.
Oh, God.
Pendatang spirit.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Shahril, thanks so much, man.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for listening to yet another episode of The Game of Impossible. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. We certainly did. If you enjoyed this conversation, we put up episodes every week, every Friday at 6 a.m. So you can subscribe to our YouTube as well as Spotify. We also have short form content on both our IG and TikTok at The Game of Impossible. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.